Today's episode of the Energy Newsbeat podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces massive challenges every day, and the events over the last 2 years have caused huge disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Today is a fabulous day. My name is Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. And I'll tell you, we got a special guest today because I do not know much about this topic. And I just really enjoyed reading the book, Shortening the Grid by Meredith Angwin. And I'll tell you, she's up in the Vermont area, and everybody that wants to know about energy needs to go buy this book right now, today. As you can see, I got a lot of questions for Meredith. Meredith, thank you, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me and for endorsing my book so much. I do want to say, while we're endorsing it, that it's available as an audiobook, and it's also available as an ebook on several platforms. So if you don't want a hard copy, there are other ways to get it.
Oh, how cool. I'll tell you, the one warning I have for you is I'm a technical kind of guy and I like technology, but there are some things in here that'll make my head hurt, when we're reading it and everything else, but it's what you need to know in order to understand the grid. And I think people need to understand the grid. I mean, it's not just, it's a big machine, as you call it.
Yes. The biggest machine that's ever been built is the grid, actually. I mean, if you think about how it all has to work together,
Right.
Which is why people who say, well, we have an aim, we're going to go to 100% renewables. So I'm like, how are you going to do it? They don't have an understanding that the grid works together, and they can't just declare 100% renewables and it'll still work the same way, or even work at all, to be honest.
While we're on that topic, just real quickly, you have the balancing, is it the balancing authorities or the BAs?
Yes, the balancing authorities.
That was just amazing on the chapters in the BAs and balancing authorities. And they got a wild ride. I mean, a wild job on that. Can you explain a little bit about what's the balancing authority?
Well, the balancing authority is the group that of people that keep the grid in balance. And the grid always has to be in balance. If there's demand, that is electricity use, that
Right.
is more than the supply, that is electricity provided, then
Right.
the grid can begin having serious problems. And so what they do is they're in this room, a dispatch room.
Right.
But they're not just looking at one unit at the dispatch, they're looking at the whole thing. They're looking at, is the frequency still within the limits it should be? Because if there's too much demand, the frequency will go down. They're also looking at their day ahead people who signed up a day ahead and saying, okay, are there some of these that I need to call on? And then they're also looking, they have to know the characteristics of the different groups, the different generators that they can call upon. For example, some generators are what's called fast response. They can come on board very fast. Other generators are not fast response. Some generators are separated from the load by inadequate transmission lines. So even if we call on those generators, it won't help that much.
Let me back up just for a little bit and help define some of those things, because I found that part intriguing. When you say a spin up quickly, it's more like a Ferrari, and an example of that is being able to go from 0 to 60 and spin up quick, as opposed to some of the others that have a little more time that they need to spin up. What's an example of a spin up quickly, or somebody that can, if you need power and the BA authority can say, give me power in a 15-minute window or something like that?
Okay, a hydro plant or a single gas turbine, not a not a combined cycle gas turbine, can spin up quickly. Okay, and a combined cycle gas turbine or any kind of steam plant usually runs flat out. But if it's required to spin up, it will spin up more slowly. It'll come up to speed over a period of, I don't know, I don't want to say but say hours instead of minutes. Okay,
that works.
And then there are the plants that you can't call on to do this. In other words, nobody can order the sun to shine, the wind to blow, and so forth. So you have a lot of different responses that you have to keep in mind. Now, one thing that is done with wind especially is that when there's too much electricity going onto the grid, then wind is sometimes curtailed. That is, the operator, the balancing authority says, we can't take your power right now. You just can't send it to us. And the wind turbines can feather their blades or do anything, and they don't have to send them the power. But what I'm saying is that this is, of course, this gets people who are pro-renewables very upset, because they go like, wait a minute, you just turned off a wind turbine. Don't you understand? It's clean electricity. But the balancing authority has the obligation to keep the grid in balance, so end users can get electricity, and so none of the power plants are actually damaged by, for example, if the frequency begins dropping too low, it can actually damage plants. So they have a lot of obligations to keep the grid in good shape, and the obligations to dispatch one kind of plant versus another kind of plant are sort of second order obligations compared to keeping the grid going.
Wow. I mean, you sit back and go, that is an ultimate orchestrator, or I mean, that is like playing a magical flute and having a whole orchestra there, because that individual in that whole thing in that control room is critical, from damaging equipment to making sure. And you have a whole chapter in here, or several chapters, about pricing. Oh my goodness. That's a whole nother discussion too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But I want to stay with the balancing authority for a minute.
Okay, great.
It's not just one person. In the ISO New England grid is not a particularly big grid, but it has, I think, 5 different stands for different people watching different things. And so, for example, they'll be watching the frequency, they'll be watching the weather, they'll be watching the day ahead projections and how they're working out today. There are, like I say, there's a whole bunch of different people, and if you go into the room with the balancing authority, among other things, you'll see an area where they're tracking liquid natural gas ships coming into Boston, and you'll see great big TV screens with local news, and you think, what, wow, you guys have enough spare time to, no, local news can affect demand on the grid. An area can go off because there's a fire, and so the line, there's so many things. So these people, to me, they're like miracle workers, and they have a very intense shifts, sort of like an emergency room doctor, and then they're off for a day or two. I mean, they need to be.
Kind of like, was it air traffic controllers were just, they've got a tough job too.
Yeah. In some ways, the grid is a tougher job, because with aircraft controllers, the only thing you're looking at is the aircraft. And with the grid, you're looking at frequency, you're looking at weather, you're looking at what plants can come on, what wind turbines just went off. You're looking at congestion on the transmission lines. It's quite a project, and While we're on the balancing authority, for example, in ISO New England, they have their main balancing authority room, which is quite an amazing thing with
Right.
the grid spread across it. In the basement of their facility, they have another one. And off-site, they have a third one.
Okay.
And the reason is that if something bad were to happen to the main balancing authority room, but it was something that happened like only at the top, they could go to the basement. If
Right.
it happened, the whole darn thing, something bad, they could get into cars are always ready to go and go to the offsite one. And another thing about that is they will go to all of these in rotation, so that
Oh, nice.
there's never a time when you would say, well, I hope the offsite one works. Nobody's used it for 6 months.
I'm sorry.
It will be used. It will be used on a rotation.
That's pretty slick. And that would be with all balancing authorities. They would have that same redundancy and those kind of things.
I can't speak to that. I think that all the big ones do, but there are smaller ones that I have no idea. I would expect they all would, but I have
Some kind of redundancy.
You're getting, at that point, you're getting into how different grids prepare for emergencies, and it isn't something that I really studied that much. So I'm going to pass on that.
But you brought up some really good points about the renewables. And as we talk about base load, and you have, we love nuclear. I mean, it's just rock solid. It goes along and everybody's happy about that. And when you were talking about the base load and everything else, as far as the renewables are so up and down and everything else, you have to calculate the renewables in a different way in order to have your access capacity in there. So remember you and I talked a little bit about that, and how do those calculations come in? The old standard was what, 20%?
Yeah, well, in the old standard, you had a grid which everything was dispatchable, and so you knew what your power, where it was coming from, and you make capacity. Well, it depends on the grid, but you could make capacity payments to the plants just for being ready to be called on. And that is obviously a good thing, because just like with the backup balancing authority dispatch centers, you don't want it to be like, hey, we never called on that plant in 8 years, so I hope it's still ready. So you pay that plant to be ready to be called upon. And so what do you do about and those capacity payments are in the areas that have capacity payments. Those capacity payments can be a very important part of the total payments for the plant. So here comes a wind turbine, and it says, well, yeah, you're paying me for my energy, you're paying me per kilowatt hour.
Right.
How I'm adding to the capacity too. Why aren't you paying me for capacity? And they say, well, we can't exactly call on you, can we? But the wind turbine said, no, come on. Another plant could go offline too, and you still give them a capacity payment. So what happens is that the wind turbines and the solar, well, solar is often rooftop, so that's a whole other story. But let's stay with the wind turbines for a minute.
Okay.
The wind turbines will get a capacity payment, but unlike a natural gas power plant, which will get a capacity payment very close to what its nameplate capacity is, lower than it, but very close to it. The wind turbine may have a nameplate capacity of 1.5 megawatts, but it will get a capacity payment of 1/10 that. So there is that, and that's because the capacity payments, it wants to get a capacity payment, but it doesn't want to be fined too often if it is called on and doesn't go on. And of course, it can't control when it calls on and doesn't go on. So the whole idea of what do you do when a plant that you just gave a capacity payment to, and you say, yeah, you, and it says, sorry, the dog ate my whatever, and I can't come online. So I'm not coming online.
Right.
So what do you do? Usually plants get some kind of penalty for that.
Right.
And so the wind turbines don't want to have a lot of penalties. And so they have they bid in at a much smaller than their nameplate capacity.
Right.
Now, that gets to be pretty weird too, because when you get right down to it, even if they're bidding in at 10% of nameplate, you can't call on them for 10% of nameplate. They can be completely non-moving.
What are you referring to, nameplate?
Nameplate. Yes. I have so many jargon that I don't even know I have. But basically what happens is if you build a big piece of equipment to put on the grid, at some point, someplace on that piece of equipment, you have a nameplate which says built by Siemens, 250 megawatts or something like that. Use it, and that is its quote nameplate capacity, and so we begin referring to what percentage of the time it can go on, or what percentage you can count on it as percentage of nameplate.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense now. When we talk about whether or not the balancing authority can reach out, you also have an interesting piece in there about pricing, because we're talking about the pricing as far as paying for being on standby. And I did not know in your chapter about bids that go in, so that you bid for the day. So one may bid 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and one may bid 30 cents a kilowatt hour. That whole bidding thing was just amazing to me, that I'm over here going, wow. And then this person, everybody gets the same fee, even if they bid 15 cents.
Yes, that's a big deal. Whether the generating facility that bids in gets paid as clear. That is, it gets paid by the amount that the highest bidder gets paid. And it doesn't get paid as bid. There's been debates about whether it should be paid as bid or paid as cleared. And in my opinion, paid as bid would be great, but I'm not a generator. And so one of the things is that when you get right down to it, there's another wrinkle, which isn't in my book, which I've been trying to explore since then. And that is, I mention it in my book, and that is some plants are allowed to set the clearing price and other plants aren't. It's called, some plants are allowed to be what's called market makers, and others are market takers. And so when a nuclear, well, I don't, the trouble is these things, the more you learn about it, the more, but in this case and in that case, you end up unable to say anything, just going like, So let me just say that the nuclear plants and many other plants are eager for a tight situation on the grid. Because in the tight situation on the grid, balancing authority will call in the most expensive plants because it needs them. Okay, it needs them. It needs those diesel plants. I mean, and so they set the clearing price. And so maybe the nuclear plant can run quite successfully and make money at 4 cents per kilowatt hour, 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But now that the balancing authority has called in a diesel plant at 20 cents, the nuclear plant is getting it too. So they're very happy. And that's one of the things that I consider to be counterproductive, counterintuitive, and counter the good of the consumer, is that the plants on the grid tend to make the most money when the grid is stressed. Because that's when the very expensive plants are being called online by the balancing authority, and they're setting the clearing price which everybody gets.
But boy, one of the things that you mentioned in the book, which shortening the grid, everybody needs to buy. Sorry, got to give you a shameless.
No, yes, absolutely. And you can get it in audiobook and ebook too.
But when we talk about you have the going out, I did not realize that, again, plants are privately owned. And when you go through and you take a look at this, is this a business model that can sustain itself in these models? A lot of the nuclear plants are maybe not on. I didn't know that, but now that I'm thinking about it, I know that there are these plants that are privately held and these. And so that really drives it. Is this a business model for this particular plant?
No, it isn't, in my opinion. As a matter of fact, it is a disaster for reliable electricity, because the model basically begins driving baseload plants off the grid. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the nuclear plants that have been forced to either shut down or receive subsidies, they're generally in RTO areas which work with the auction. And you never hear, for example, that a plant in Florida is going to have to shut down because it's not profitable, because Florida isn't an RTO area. But you do hear about a plant in Michigan is going to have to shut down because it's not profitable. And of course, we're happy to see that Palisades may actually come back. I'm very happy about that.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is that in the RTO areas tend to have the more vulnerable plants. I will not say that no nuclear plant in a non-RTO area has ever shut down for lack of profitability, but I will say that if you're in a RTO area, you're much more at risk, nuclear plant or a coal plant. And let me just continue this a little bit for a moment to say, this is why I named the book Shorting the Grid, in homage to The Big Short, because of The Big Short, the beginning of it was about how mortgage market had been turned upside down by the fact that a liar loan, that is a loan that somebody never gave any background that they had a job, that they had a down payment, nothing. So they were liars, and it was called a liar loan. Was just as profitable for the bank as a loan to a well-regarded cardiac surgeon who had an amazing, had half a 50% down payment. So what I'm trying to say is the value of the loan to the bank didn't matter. And now the value of the kilowatts to the grid doesn't matter. The fact that the kilowatts from a wind turbine cannot be counted on, and the kilowatts from a nuclear plant can be counted on, that doesn't matter to the grid anymore. And that is going to lead, no matter how you decide to just arrange the payments, that's going to be a disaster. Just a disaster, that's it.
Wow. Okay, you just nailed it right there, because I spent all this time on the book and everything else, but that is cool stuff. Now, when you also talk about the renewable sections and everything else, I guess balancing authorities don't like the renewable section as much, because they got to, when they spin it up, there's only certain amounts of time that those renewables are okay. And you also mentioned storage. You lose electricity or power when you go into storage. You lose it when it comes back out. So the balancing authority also has to realize on that time, and people that own that time or own those facilities. How do you pay for a storage facility? My goodness.
Well, the storage facility, the sort of the good news for the storage facility is that it plans to put things into storage when they're cheap on the grid and take them out of storage when it's expensive. So the storage facility is paying for itself, but we are also losing electricity as it goes in and out of the storage facility.
Right. But and let me ask, I'm just kind of having fun with this, but if the grid is the windmill and the solar panel, are they set up so they can go straight to a storage without affecting the BAs or the balancing authorities? Because that to me seems like that would be even more of a headache.
Well, depends on which one. Okay, let me say that in general, a wind turbine does not have its own storage facility. It just sends it to the grid. And if the grid is overloaded, the grid operator, if it's available, will perhaps send to the storage facility.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, Alex Epstein, who's very pro fossil and pro nuclear and pro reliability, and he at one point when he was interviewing me, he said, well, you could cure this by just telling all the wind turbines have to have their own storage facility. They have to bid in the same as anybody else and so forth, and at that point they'd be too expensive. Anyway, that is, I'm maybe misquoting him, but he was very much like, one way you can deal with it. The fact that he said is one way you can deal with it is if you've got some kind of a system like a wind turbine that goes off when it darn well pleases, make it have its own storage.
And that's what I was asking, because when you sit there and you think about the physics, you were mentioning physics. This is all about the transfer of electricity through physics. And it didn't make any sense to me that grids are putting storage on when the buffering needs to happen at the renewable site. That's exactly what I was sitting there thinking. And by the way, just as a plug to myself, I've had Alex twice on my podcast and stuff. He is a cool cat. I really like his story that he's got out there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The thing is, when I first encountered him, when I'm pro-nuclear, I'm like, yeah, right, he likes fossil, whatever, But recently, that was before I began actually attending the consumer liaison group and actually realizing the role of the balancing authority and actually realizing that I want reliable energy. And I prefer it to be nuclear, but it has to be reliable. It just has to be reliable. I mean, when I was, our son-in-law is from India, and when he was growing up, electricity was available for a couple of hours a day.
Wow.
That's it. And I don't want to go to that kind of place in America.
Now, that brings up a great point, because I love India and I'd love to go travel India and everything else. But in Europe, they're in a total cotton picking disaster right now. And it's like they just shot themselves in the foot, and the splatter is going to get the rest of the world. I mean, do you remember Dick Cheney when he shot his hunting partner? I think that
I don't usually go with that kind of analogy, but yes, I do remember.
Well, I mean, Europe is absolutely destroying the energy markets, and you also bring up some funny things about New England having to buy LNG from a couple of different places,
Trinidad and supposedly some Russian LNG was mixed in with it, which was a big scandal around here because supposedly we don't buy from Russia. This is even a long time ago, but basically there are a whole lot of issues with that. The first one is clearly the Jones Act, which means that we can't get a ship to carry LNG from Louisiana to Boston. And the reason is that all the LNG ships are foreign flagged, and the Jones Act said that only American flagged vessels can move American goods between two American ports. And so we must import all our LNG. But if you really begin thinking, I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about there's more. The Jones Act is just the tip of the iceberg. Why don't we have American flagged ships? That's
Yeah.
another important question. Why don't we have pipelines so that we don't need the ships?
Well,
I mean,
you're talking to the you're talking not to the preacher, but the choir over here, because the Jones Act was done in 1920, and it may have had a good thing to do in about 15 minutes, but there is a wartime exclusion that the president can waive. The president can waive that because all the big ships, Meredith, are made in foreign areas, and these are our ships are too expensive to even operate. I mean, they're older, and our fleet is coming offline. And I'm like, let's just take the pen and sign a waiver, and we can get rid of the Jones Act. And your book talks about pipelines as well too. I mean, build a pipeline.
I don't know if you saw Doomberg had a really cute little about New England energy, and he had a map, and on the map he had a Marcellus Shale area circled, and he had Boston circled, and he said, pipeline from one to the other, problem solved.
I love Doomberg. If anybody wants some good information, and I saw Doomberg regressing here on a podcast, and having that little chicken just sitting there talking was absolutely, if that's a green thing, is a little chicken. Yeah. But for anybody that doesn't know, they need to read Doomberg stuff. They're good knowledge or good information there.
And yeah, absolutely true. But I want to also say that one of the things about LNG, whether or not we have the ships, whether it's brought from Houston
Right.
on the ship to Boston, one thing is it's an international market. When Boston is going to be competing
Right.
with Europe and Asia for those cargoes.
Right.
And so right now, in general, pipeline natural gas is running like 1/5 to 1/10 of the cost of LNG per BTU. And that's because pipeline natural gas isn't an international market. There's nobody really bidding on it. There's someone at the end of the pipeline who's made a deal to get the gas.
Yes.
But there's not a bidding war. But if you get into LNG, you're in a bidding war. And and to some extent, even the fact that we're exporting LNG is raising the price of our gas. I'm not making a statement about this in any way, because I don't really try to figure out whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing. Right. I'm just saying that if you have a gas well and you're going to send it to a LNG manufacturing train, or you're going to put it in a pipeline, it may make a difference to how much you get paid and what you choose to do. So you may say, okay, I'm going to put as much into LNG as I can, and if there's leftovers, I'll put some along the pipeline. Of course, their pipelines have contracts, and so it isn't quite as stark as I'm putting it. But I just feel that we have to acknowledge that natural gas is a very in-demand commodity.
Right.
And everything we do to put ourselves in a position where we're competing with the rest of the world for it is not going to be good for us.
No.
We are in a situation where we have our own LNG, my God, our own natural gas. My gosh, so many countries would like to be in that situation.
It just is so foreign to me that we're not a little bit more logical, because pipeline is the single best way to transport energy. I mean, it has less emissions and everything else, plus lower cost to the consumers. And it just is, it's crazy to me that in back east, they're getting rid of gas. And I believe it was in your book, you can correct me if this is not right, but if New England, or they're not having enough natural gas, they would shut it off to other places so they can get gas to heat the homes. But now they're not putting as much gas in homes. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that isn't happening very fast. Let's put it
Okay.
this way. At this point, the idea so far is that natural gas will not be installed in new homes or homes that undergo a massive remodeling.
Right.
But if you have natural gas in your home right now, you can continue to use it. Meanwhile, we will be giving you some kind of incentive, financial incentive, to use a
Right.
heat pump instead and use electricity.
Okay, you just brought up a hot button for me. A heat pump. When we have 75% of our electrical energy made by fossil fuels, they're putting out heat pumps in these areas to try to save the economy. And it's like, you're still burning fossil fuels.
Well, yeah, well, the same is true with a electric vehicle that needs to be charged. I mean, what are you charging it with? And you know, I have seen many articles which say it's
Right.
still better or it's worse or whatever. And my feeling is, no, if you're using fossil fuels to charge, to make the electricity that charges your EV,
Right.
you may be gaining a little bit, but you're probably not. You're probably not.
Right.
And, yeah, go
And
ahead.
sorry, I got real tickled because on Twitter the other day, I saw a picture of a Tesla and a trailer with a generator sitting on the back. I just thought that was really pretty funny.
Oh, yeah, it was very funny. What it meant is that basically, let's say that you have a gas-fired vehicle,
Right.
and you're careless, and you run out of gas on the freeway, and you pull over to the side, and you kind of
Right.
hail somebody, and they take you to a gas station, and you can come back from the gas station with a can of gas, and at least it'll get you to the gas station to fill up.
Right.
But if your EV runs out in the same position, what do? Well, that's what they did. The little generator was pulled by a pickup truck, and there it go. I mean, it is something to think about. I don't like to bash things, but I have to say there's something for a fuel that you can carry or store or whatever.
Right.
And the whole first part of my book is the insane amount of problems we got into in New England because we didn't have enough power plants with fuel stored on site. And so we had to pay to have the grid operator paid to have oil stored on site at the power
Right.
plants that could store it, so that when the gas plants couldn't get gas because homeowners were using
Right.
gas, there'd be something to run the grid on.
Well, how many of the natural gas plants are actually dual function? Because some are not. There's some that are. I mean, there's an equipment difference, isn't there, between having dual function?
I read about that, and basically, it's kind of a complicated situation. And
Yeah.
basically, if you have a modern natural gas plant
Right.
that can be dual fired, it will use a distillate fuel. Like,
Oh, yes.
okay, if you have an older natural gas plant, which can be run, it will use a raw fuel, not raw, like right out of the ground, but basically it won't be a distillate fuel.
Right.
And it will, the one that uses the fuel that is more raw, that is
Right.
not distillate, it usually has a lot more storage available
Oh,
than the plants that use distillate fuel. There was I should probably send it to you, but basically there was
okay.
ISO New England did some background material on this.
Right.
What percentage was residual fuel, what percentage was distillate fuel, how much could be
Right.
saved, stored, and so forth. But basically, as the residual fuel plants go offline because they're not used very much,
Right.
the distillate fuel plants stay online, but they don't have as much storage facility.
Now, you also mentioned in your book, yes, I did read it. I'm just letting you know, the
I love it. I love that. All those little marks saying that I want to ask her about this one. I love it.
That's exactly what it was. When we talk about on-site storage, you mentioned in there that there's a penalty sometimes for these folks, and they shouldn't have on-site storage. I thought that was kind of weird. I mean,
it's not a penalty per se that somebody arranged. It's just that if you're a gas-fired power plant,
right,
and you decide you're going to have on-site storage because you want to be a good kid and you want to be reliable,
right,
you without the grid operator paying you, you are going to do two things to yourself. First of all, you're going to have this upfront cost that you may not be able to recapture. And secondly, if all the gas-fired plants do that, then the clearing price on the grid will stay low and nobody will make money. You know,
that makes sense.
The problem is that the plants on the grid have the opposite incentive than I do. I want my electricity to be on and cheap. They want the electricity to be teetering on the edge and expensive, because that's where they make their money.
That just doesn't make sense, but it does. I mean, I understand it. They're trying to run a business. So, you know, that's what it is. I'll tell you, Meredith, again, your book is absolutely worth the read. And in our last little segment here, what would you change if you had your ideas, or have you thought about what can we do? And I need to plug this book, by the way. This book, I thought, I have not read it yet, but it is Campaigning for Clean Air. What do you do if you want to be an advocate for nuclear? I'm sorry. I think that's a great idea. Here's what everybody needs to do in order to go out and root for nuclear. So there's another book. Anyway, so I bought two of them there for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay.
But when we sit back and we take a look, I just had a senior moment. I forgot what my great point was.
What would I change on the grid?
Yes.
Okay, the first thing I would do is make sure that no nuclear plant shuts down for the next a bunch of years, assuming that they are continue to pass their inspections and so forth. And they do. They're very, very good. Then I would try to build more nuclear for baseload, and even if it's an expensive build, the reliability and the fact that nobody can just say, well, I'm cutting off the gas right now. You know, that's what happened in Europe. They say, okay, I'm cutting off the gas right now. Now, France is having problems with its nuclear plants due to poor maintenance, but nobody is shutting them off for it.
Germany is I can't believe they're doubling down on stupid. I mean, they just announced, I believe it was a couple of days ago, that they said, we're going to keep on our path of mothballing our 3 nuclear reactors, but we're going to keep them maybe in the ready. Meredith, that's about as dumb as I possibly could.
That is extremely dumb. And to be honest, that wouldn't happen in the United States, because if you have a nuclear plant, you're paying the NRC for your license and for on-site inspectors. And so if you decide you're going to mothball it, you're still going to be paying them because they consider it to be a nuclear plant on the verge of operation. Wow. So when
what about California's? Didn't they just make the announcement that they're going to keep, it's not Indian Point, but whatever.
Diablo Canyon. Yes, they did.
Yes, thank you.
Diablo Canyon is still running and was scheduled to continue running till 2025. What they have said now is that we're going to keep it running longer. So they are planning to continue to pay the NRC, but that's okay because they have an operating plant. The question is, if you mothball your plant and you're still paying all the NRC fees as if you had an operating plant, where are the fees coming from? So that wouldn't happen in the United States, and even in Germany. And I don't know how their
Right.
regulatory setup is, but it strikes me as really stupid. And basically, run them for Pete's sake. And as a matter of fact, they probably will run them this winter. They're not going to let everything go freezing, because they might have an actual, I wouldn't say a rebellion, but if
social unrest.
more social unrest than they want.
Yes.
The thing is, when you have serious social unrest, the people who are really good at directing it tend to be the extremists on the right and the left.
Right.
And so you don't want social unrest if you want to keep a democracy going. And you don't want a situation where everybody is going to be in such bad shape that they're going to be cheering for the people doing the social unrest.
Right. Or paying people for being the social unrest people. I'm kidding, of course. I didn't say that. But now, what is coming around the corner, Meredith, for you? Do you have other books? What's coming around the corner?
Well, I have ideas for a book. People are saying, what are you writing now? And
Yep.
Right now, I really just sort of want to get the word out about this book, because it's a very relevant book. And
yes.
I want people to buy it. I want to give talks about it and all that sort of thing. Okay.
Nice.
But for the future, I think I want to do an updated version of it, which will actually probably have a different title. I mean, since this book was published, when this book was published, the example I used was a near miss on the New England grid. Since then, we've had Texas, we have Europe, we have, according to Bloomberg recently, was it Bloomberg? Anyway, one person was like, do you realize that Switzerland is making a law saying that you can be arrested for having your household thermostat above 66 degrees in the winter? Things like that, just they weren't happening when I was writing the book. And they definitely, the book is predictive of it, but I mean, the ramifications of what's actually gone on, I mean, I just feel like somebody has to write about it. Now, the question is that somebody me? And I mean, I know a huge amount about it, but I'm wondering where the balance is between making new content and getting this content out to people.
Some authors do this. Here's the original book, and then he just added a smaller book to it and has it as another one. So you might want to do that. And the reason is, Meredith, your book, and I'm not hate to plug it again, but your book is timely very back then, and a good book by an author remains relevant for a long period of time. And having that little book that goes along with this one does make a lot of sense, because there's only four countries in Europe that did not import energy this year from their grid. And so the rest of them are dependent on other people, and they're importing in from them.
Yeah, I agree. But that's a good idea. I'm trying to think it through, because I mean, I'm just trying to think it through. Like, for example, if I did a new edition of this book, what I'd have to do is I'd have to check my references to see that they're still available, or if they're not available. I mean, it's just anyway. So I just wanted to. I mean, it could be a massive job. I mean, we have in this book, 292 references. It is a very well-researched book, if I say so myself.
It is. And by the way, in the end notes and everything else, I checked all of your references. They all checked out.
Yeah, well,
I'm not kidding. I'm kidding about checking all your references.
Well, there's some I think that were misassigned to a different footnote or something, but basically we checked them over as hard as we could, and I'm very concerned with the credibility. We're doing everything to keep credibility. I don't want to have a book that's, I wouldn't put it out there if it wasn't very solidly credible. And so that is one thing I did.
Well, Meredith, we will have all of your contact information in there. And I just really, truly thank you for our delightful time today. And your book, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I mean, it sounds kind of strange, but you're making, there's a lot of detail in there. But on that detail is some stuff people need to understand about the grid. And I learned a lot because I didn't know much about the grid. So thank you for stopping by our podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
All right. We will see you soon, and we'll have all the show notes and everything in there. So thank you.
Thank you.